And I would love to introduce you to David Wilson, who is the founder and CEO of Fosway Group. And that, of course, is Europe's #1 HR industry analyst. And David is a major commentator on the HR, talent, and learning industries for over 20 years. Now, David personally leads Fosway's research and the corporate advisory agenda. And most recently, this year, David was recognised at the start of this year with the Colin Corder Award for his outstanding services to the industry. So I would like to welcome David to this session and hand over to him whilst he takes you through his presentation. And I'll see you in a little while.
Hi, thank you, Sarah, and thanks to everybody for joining today. Always interesting to listen to the preamble on these things, and I'm not sure I've necessarily learned anything in the period prior to this, other than a bit of patience, I guess, in terms of what's going on. So thanks for joining us today, and hopefully you find the session interesting, and look forward to your questions, which we'll try and get to later. So, and what I'm going to try and talk about here is a combination, really, of a couple of things, and in particular, obviously, Fosway's research around COVID and the impact this is having on L&D particularly, and also some thoughts around, where we go next in terms of following on from that. If you're not familiar with Fosway, we're an industry analyst. We're based in Europe, and we've been tracking the market around next-gen HR, talent and learning since the late 90s. That does make me sound kind of rather old now, but what we've been doing is really tracking what a lot of corporate organizations particularly are doing, who they're doing it with, what works, what doesn't, etc., and then trying to bring back a lot of insights to the market to help you understand what is really going on. So let's put the word real into a lot of this, and also to understand the options in the supply side. So some of you will be familiar with us also because of our Fosway 9 grids, for example, and some of our other research, digital learning realities research, and so on. So what I want to do is draw on that, really, and try and give you a sense of both how we see the market in terms of tracking, obviously, all of the conversations, and really tracking how everything is changing from the COVID perspective, but also, as I said, some insights around maybe where that goes, where you can go going forward, and hopefully give you some data points to help you in your organization as you're having conversations, maybe trying to justify doing things differently or doing new things, but also in terms of actually trying to really accelerate your success. One of the things that we've been looking at for a long time, obviously, is the whole trend around digital transformation of learning. And this always, I feel, was a sort of a bit of a Pac-Man moment, effectively, where over time what we've seen is the proportion of organizations with the orange box, which is around in progress, sort of gradually increasing, and sort of increasingly eating the diagram. But this is all pre-COVID, right? So we may have actually been increasing our proportion of digital transformation, and quite clearly in progress hides a multitude of sins. It can be anything from barely started to, I think I've just about finished, but maybe I've just realized I'm on the first steps of the journey. In reality, for almost everybody, the thing that's really driven digital transformation, of course, has been the whole transition to COVID. I mean, effectively, as suddenly nobody was in the office, everybody was remote. You had no choice but to be digital and online, and if you weren't, there was no game at all. So, digital transformation for most companies wasn't driven by a vision or even by the CTO. It's been driven by this COVID story, and that's massively distorted the world of learning, of course, as you're all familiar with. Let me focus now on some of Fosway's specific research. So we started actually looking at the COVID topic for a couple of different reasons. I mean, first of all, obviously we knew it was having a big impact, and the conversations we were having with heads of learning and heads of HR and so on, it was clear that they were being really challenged in a way they'd probably never been before. The questions they were being asked by their board on a daily basis, maybe based on the announcements the government had made the night before, it was a really huge moving target, and it was obviously very, very difficult to understand how what the shape of everything was going to be, even in a very short-term basis. And we moved very quickly from that very challenging, the sky's fallen in moment, into a kind of like, how do we create a new, almost business as usual mode where everybody's working from home? And obviously for L&D, that's had a massive impact. And it's no huge surprise to anybody that that's obviously impacted, the whole strategy and what L&D has been doing. In some ways, it's surprising that maybe only 94-95% of people have said that it's impacting what their L&D strategy is. Right? It's hard to understand who it hasn't impacted, even for businesses that are virtual. And in some ways, Fosway is a bit like that in terms of the way we function internally. We're typically, and most people are working from home, most of our analyst team and so on, but it still had a big impact on us. But I think 2 in 3 organizations, talking about making really significant changes about what they do and how they do it. And what we've seen is L&D functions in some ways sort of turning on the head of a pin. Suddenly they had to do everything online. If anything that was face-to-face was immediately off the table. And that has also resulted, obviously, in huge changes in patterns around kind of activity and spend and resources and everything else. And that's not a straightforward process. Only 1 in 4 organizations found that relatively easy to make that transition and change their operations to support it. 42% found it difficult to cope with the impact on their L&D operation. The other factor, of course, within this as well is, is your team, and it obviously depends around the world in terms of your government's approach towards employed positions and so on. And obviously in the UK and in Europe particularly, we've had a very strong strategy around furloughing staff or enabling companies to furlough staff at government cost. So that's obviously impacted the L&D team as well in terms of some of their own resources being potentially furloughed, particularly obviously training resources and so on. So this is obviously a bit challenging. Everybody's found an impact. What does it really change though in terms of activity and kind of spend? And again, this in some ways is fairly obvious, but here is maybe a chart that almost everybody can get some value from and use internally thinking around it. Is what's happened? We've basically done everything online. So use of digital learning content, use of digital learning platforms massively spiked, and this is even relative, obviously, to the historic trend where all of this was increasing before. But also on the other side of that, look at the bottom of this, the use of obviously trainers and external training activities and so on has had a disproportionately negative impact as well, of course. So basically, unless you're, as I said, unless you're digital and unless you're online, you're not in the game at all now. So there's been this huge swing towards it. And I think it's really then kind of critical to maybe understand where that's been driven from. Yes, it's not. It may be the only thing that you can do, but actually, is there other underlying drivers behind that we need to understand a bit more? One thing that's kind of clear and useful to understand is that, first of all, it's being driven from all parts of the spectrum. So yes, there's a massive increase in demand from the end learner here. 71% of seeing a higher demand for digital learning from their learners. But also there's a massive demand from the business. In fact, a higher proportion, they're saying that 82% saying that senior stakeholders of it. Obviously, companies are massively transforming, right? They're changing, that demands a requirement to reach people, and obviously, so a lot of that has also come in a push mode, effectively, from senior leaders in the business who are trying to now create strategies and reach out to staff and keep the wheels on the road. That was an expression actually that in an early conversation we had, the bank is, where we're talking about almost how can we keep the lights on when we go through this early stages of it. So that gives you a kind of bit of an overall sense around, the sort of underlying kind of changes. Maybe let's look a bit more granular now in terms of what companies are using to actually address this. So first question, is from what platforms and solution are they using? And this is, you can hear a lot of discussion around, for example, things like learning experience platforms and next-gen learning environments and MOOCs and learning record stores, etc., and things like this. In reality, obviously, we've seen a big increase in usage of almost every learning platform across the business. But the key thing here is, when you look at it, it's traditional things. LMSs, nearly 80% of organizations using those. Virtual classrooms, nearly 90% of organizations using virtual classrooms. So as we are, obviously in running the event today, so we're seeing huge increases across the whole spectrum, but particularly, I would say, around some of those traditional things. Interesting looking there, social and collaborative learning. Again, very high proportion of users, over 70% saying they're using that. And interestingly, when you then find out where those platforms have come from, were existing, 21% of companies have actually implemented a completely new solution in order to support their things, or significantly expanded the number of licenses they've used. So whilst actually companies had some of the pieces in place for this, they didn't necessarily have a fully baked solution that would enable them to respond, and they certainly hadn't tested it based on the all-consuming kind of need set that we have now, where all learners are pretty much remote. 10% have rushed through some kind of new procurement project. So we've seen evidence of this obviously in the market, both in terms of our corporate conversations and also the tracking activity with the vendors and so on. Is obviously we've seen just a huge spike of activity. So actually, obviously, looking at the conversations we have on the vendor side, I think obviously lots of people, particularly in March sort of time frame, were very uncertain around what was happening. And clearly, if you're a vendor working in certain market sectors like retail and hospitality or airlines and things like this, some of those customers are very, very challenged around the situation they were in. But obviously also others, everybody has seen a massive spike in the numbers. So every vendor will talk to you about, the data from their portal. One of the nice things around, everything being in the cloud, or a lot of things being in the cloud now, is that you can get really strong data from everybody talking about the activity, huge activity increases around it. One of the things, though, it's interesting is that when you look at this, and it comes back to the point about who found this easy and who didn't to some degree, what is really obvious here is that actually underneath this, that the maturity of an organization has with how they look at digital learning and how they understand what it's doing has a really significant impact on their ability to respond. So interestingly, from the research that we conducted, even though actually I would say we still typically hit a much more LT savvy audience, right? Partly because obviously of all the work that we do with learning technologies and so on, and the research that we run. Our network is, if you do this for 20 years, you expect to get access. Most people that are doing things kind of engage with you in some way. So I would say we have a technology savvy audience generally in terms of engage with Fosway, but only 59% of those still consider their approach to digital learning, I would say at a systemic level, as being immature. So I think that's a key thing is, everybody maybe has kind of done something or whatever, but actually there's a big difference between doing bits of it or only using it for some basic compliance learning to suddenly become your only game in town. And interestingly, if an organization is mature, they've twice as likely to have found that coping easy. Or if they're other ways, if they're immature, they're 3 times more likely to find it difficult, right? So I think one of the things that you absolutely need to do in looking at your organization is understand where you sit in that spectrum and where you are. Because I think we talk to lots of organizations, and if you go to the Learning Technologies Conference in London and related things around the world, similar things. There's a lot. The activity level around this is huge, but actually the number of organizations which I think have got a mature approach to it. They understand that it doesn't necessarily, quotes, do what it says on the tin, right? And understanding how to drive success and understanding how they put the jigsaw together, their learning technology ecosystems and so on, and how they really can support more than just basic knowledge kind of transfer stuff, right? So how do I, yes, fine, I can tick a box on a compliance training and I can make sure everybody's, has some familiarity, but everybody's been really challenged at the speed with which they're trying to meet. And the other thing is, at the end of the day, just having people attend stuff has no real value, right? Other than it makes you feel better that they're included, or it enables you to tick boxes on reports. The question is, are they able to do their job better? Are they able to function effectively in the mode that you're talking about? In very early days, I had a conversation with somebody who said to me, we spent 3 weeks rolling out some training on how you use Zoom or an online platform, and to people that in the evening are already running their Zumba classes on it. Sometimes corporates have really been challenged to track up, to actually respond fast enough. But at the end of the day, I think what we're seeing is a huge transformation within L&D to be able to engage positively with this. The other thing I wanted to just kind of also do is share a couple of other bits of data around what's been effective. So this is obviously also, interesting. As I said, it's not just about activity; it's also around outcomes and what actually helps you do it. So this chart focuses on what types of learning content organizations have been using. And as you can see right at the top of this, the two highest ones by a reasonably high margin are around video content and using curated content assets. Interestingly, if you look about 2/3 of the way down, we've got off-the-shelf e-learning courses, where maybe less than 50% are finding those successful in some way. Probably half the overall figure that we're finding around video and curated content. So what we're seeing within this is actually it's not just about sticking a bunch of content assets online, in particular not traditional e-learning content libraries. It's around providing focused resources and content. And I think one of the reasons video is proving to be very popular is just because the speed with which people can share it and maybe consume it to some degree, and also the ability to record maybe and distribute quite tailored, quite very focused content around it, together with maybe some kind of curated content libraries and so on. And I have to be fair, the vendors here have been really, really helpful in that, in terms of driving, I think, and enabling this by actually making lots of assets available. Sometimes, COVID libraries and things for free for existing customers, and trying to lower the barrier of entry for others who are trying to increase the level of usage around it. The other thing is, from a platform perspective, what's been successful here, and we talked about virtual classroom as being one of the areas that has really one of the highest increase in usage, but it's also one of the ones that people have found the most successful. And with all the limitations, with all of the challenges around worrying about suddenly the security of these things, with worrying about audio and video, and I noted in the preamble to all of this in some of the comments, thinking about we're more accepting maybe of maybe lower quality, not perfect video and things, because kind of it's almost the only thing we have. Learning experience, is a key topic that comes up again. But I mean, when we talk about accessing curated content assets, again, that's been very successful at being able to do it. Collaborative learning tools, so ones which are built within a social or more of a discussive format, etc. And of course, the LMSs. At the end of the day, for most companies, the main tools they had to be able to reach out and make this available were their LMS platforms, maybe a multiplicity of them in many companies, rather than necessarily just one. So we shouldn't forget the fact that's also been critical in driving that success. So that's presented maybe a little bit of a view around some of the underlying data. Hopefully some of that's useful. And as I said, in thinking about, these slides, this data, we created it really just because we thought we should, and it would be useful to help people understand what the opportunity was as well. So hopefully, some of that's useful to you. As I said, please access the slides afterwards, and hopefully it helps you in terms of internal conversations. Just moving on, just for the last few minutes, really, just thinking about so what, right? What does that now mean? Where next, right? And I think the thing that is clear already very strongly is we are not going back, right? The barriers that were there for companies to really push digital and use it as the central, to be almost digitally driven rather than necessarily just using digital in a few spaces. Those barriers have just been blown apart completely. And whilst I think, and we still don't know from a work pattern and a future work point of view how long the impact of this will be. What we know is we're not going to go straight back into a pre-normal situation, an old normal scenario very, very quickly, if at all and ever. So from an L&D point of view, I think it's quite clear also that we're never going to go back to that kind of pre-state of where we were around L&D, which is around, in some cases, I would say, a reluctant adoptions of a digital approach, or very much a kind of very segmented view where it's maybe used for some lower value learning activities. We really do need to be able to think about this in a much more significant way. There's another underlying fact. This is also pre-COVID data, right? This is looking at how fit for purpose were your learning platforms for the modern workforce, right? So this was also a modern workforce that was largely at that point still working in offices or in factories and wherever it is. We already knew that it wasn't fit for purpose then. 65% of organizations saying it wasn't fit for purpose for them, and that number is increasing, not decreasing. And now we lay COVID on top of this. This really makes a significant difference. From a point of view of going back, as I said, the answer is very clear. Only 5% think their strategy will go back to some before. And maybe even if we ask this question now, we would get a different answer again. 67% saying that this shift is going to not just continue, but it's going to change not just how we do stuff, but what we do as well, and how we kind of think about it. So really big changes. How do you then think about what you should do? So what are your kind of some headlines for me in terms of thinking about how you build that strategy going forward, rather than just reacting to the imperative that COVID has brought onto organizations in the short term? So first of all, focus on the impact that you make. One of the things I think is too easy is to just get besotted and focus on the system side of the story, focusing on the digital bit of it. You have to also understand how it changes the way that you function and what you do, the culture effectively that you're trying to build of learning an organization, and the culture within the L&D team, the skills that you have, etc. But ultimately, this all needs to get driven by the impact that you're trying to make in the organization. And I think one of the things that COVID has also done is it's enabled L&D in some ways to simplify its agenda. Historically, I think L&D has been very guilty of this habit of delivery and focusing so much of its resource on the business as usual story. And, COVID has kind of completely blown that apart. And I think organizations have had to really prioritize and focus and simplify what they're doing. And within that, focusing on things that actually really do make a difference, I think is hugely important. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is understand the context in your audience and what you're trying to achieve. So a lot of the focus that we've seen in terms of during the COVID period has been very basically focused around enabling us to function on a day-to-day basis, right? So it's kind of very much around an operational performance agenda. But at the same time, organizations are dealing with quite profound changes around the way they're looking at their workforce and the assumptions around the place of work and how things will function. So the whole agenda around talent, probably areas, everybody talked a lot about skills and the fact that their inability to recruit skills. A lot of the skills that you were trying to recruit in the past are the ones that are even more in demand now. That problem is going to get worse, not better. So thinking around how you really empower and change the organization And how you enable the organization to be much more agile becomes really, really critical. And at some point within this, we're now also, in some ways, disintermediating workers from the workplace, right? So historically, the basis, the kind of cultural view organizations have had is around the workplace was the place of work, and that's the way people, and the way they engaged with it was based on that. Their sense of value maybe was based on that. And I think, so maybe the other piece that's happening here is the being the best me angle, the kind of what's in it for me piece as an individual becomes even more critical as well. And we need to be addressing some of these things as well. The other thing that we're doing is, and this is an old model, if anybody's seen this, this is a learning ecosystem diagram that David Perring, our Director of Research, drew in 10 years ago. Okay, so it's not a new diagram, but it's what we've really seen is that shift in terms of what we're trying to do, where we're trying to do it, and how we're trying to do it in terms of what learning is about. And in a post-pandemic kind of scenario, this is just massively accelerated even further. The context for learning are less in the classroom and less in the workplace. The strategies for learning are less about kind of face-to-face and blend and basic knowledge acquisition being done online. Now we need to do other things. And the outcomes we're kind of changing are also very much focused around, and how we relate those back to the individual work activities. This change is being massively accelerated. Also within this, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with the kind of discussion around, obviously, the whole learning experience story, and actually making this more central to the proposition. Historically, learning experience was a byproduct almost of what L&D was doing. Now it's become a kind of central proposition. And obviously this is, from a COVID point of view, that's become even more important. Now 91% of companies are saying this is important. But what is the learning experience you're trying to enable? What does that really mean? It's not just about a pretty user interface. It's not just about a way of accessing content, right? It's actually around the whole thing around what learning is and how it plays in an organization and how you can make that more agile. If there's one thing that COVID has done to every company, it's made it have to be agile, or if it isn't, it's probably going to cease to exist to some degree. So think about that learning experience in that broader context as well, and try and really understand that this is really important to us. We're doing some deep research this year, driving into a number of the areas under, for example, what people would call out learning experience platforms, to really understand what those disruptions are around and what the value is. You'll see a lot more of that from us later in the year. The other thing is that we keep talking about, and I remember going back 20 years ago doing research looking at blended learning and things like that. And I think L&D historically has been fixated around one idea, which is blending learning with itself. So, what was online, what was in the classroom, what was face-to-face, etc. The most important thing about blending learning is it needs to be blended with work. Integrating learning and work is one of the most critical things you can do. And I think the other byproduct that we've seen in this COVID research is organizations get a lot more focused on maybe where that learning is available. It's less about going to the LMS or even to an LXP, and actually more about how that digital content, digital collaboration, digital learning support is available within that work context. And 84% of L&D leaders now saying that they see that as critical, that embeds in the collaborative tools of the company, things like Teams and Slack and et cetera, and those types of things. So hopefully that gives you a real sense of how we see this overall. The research that I've talked about, and obviously including the specific COVID research is available from our website. Also, from a Fosway point of view, the 9 grids, a lot of these topics we were already looking at in a lot of detail before COVID. COVID has just magnified those things, and we're looking at learning systems, including specialists, the learning system specialists and suites, etc., and obviously also from a digital learning perspective. So I kind of look at the 9 grids, look at the 9 grid reports and some of the trends that were in there. Hopefully that's been of use. If you want to scan the QR code, that will take you straight away to a page on our website which has more information. It has the infographic around our COVID research. It also has access to the slides and also some links to some other online content and things that you might find useful. Thank you very much.
David, thank you so much for sharing all that useful and valuable information. I know that that will be so useful for so many of us out there, and it will help our decision making as we move forward. Now, no surprise to you here, but there has been loads and loads of questions for you. So just let me have a little look here. So let's start off on some inventive things. Christine is asking, what are some of the new inventive things that you are seeing where people have kind of found that new wriggle room? What are the things that have kind of made you think, oh, interesting?
I mean, first of all, I think the pursuit of wiggle room is actually a really interesting strategy and topic in its own right. I think one of the things that has been maybe positively, very positive but very surprising, is the fact just how fast L&D, how creative L&D has got around both the tools it's used and the resources it's used to be able to reach people that it was otherwise not going to be able to do. And we can say we could be critical of maybe their level of preparation, and sometimes there were reluctant players around it. I mean, obviously, one of the big things is just the ability to use very basic curated assets and to share those very quickly in organizations, the use of Zoom and online tools to be able to reach things very fast. I think what we've seen is some of the traditional, go back to the slide where I was talking before around, what content has been useful. It's interesting, some of the sort of very speculative things. So look at gaming, for example, and looking at some of these maybe other tools, other ideas, virtual reality, etc., and things like that. They're not very high in terms of the proportion, both of adoption or of value, right? So I think some of the other surprising is where maybe some of the new, more sexy kind of things haven't necessarily been able to step up as well. So it's not just about what delivers value, it's also what doesn't or what hasn't been able to do it. I think the key thing here is about time to value, right? So the biggest thing that's driven most people is, it goes back to the point in some ways where it says we're less worried about having perfect video and perfect audio. We're more worried about getting the message across. And I think to some degree being very pragmatic within that, as I said, has been a strategy that everybody's had to be, rather than trying to design perfect experiences. But I think the other side of that worries me as well is I think there is a tendency just to be online means we've done something, right? And as I said, just because you've run something or somebody's engaged with it doesn't mean they've learned anything, doesn't mean they can do their job better, etc. So I would also at the same time try and push organizations to be a little bit more robust in understanding what's delivering value within what they're doing rather than just what's enabled them to get out there.
I agree with you totally on that, David. So as I said, there's loads of questions coming through. So we've got one here on learning design. I'm just going to go through some of the key groupings that we've got together. So Janet has asked, what are your thoughts on the decrease in learning designers, and will the new world have decent pedagogy?
So I think, first of all, because of that focus on just getting out there and being quick, right, has probably enabled organizations. So one of the sort of sacred cows that's been thrown out of the little bit of the window in the process, it's not a really good analogy, but anyway, is the need for this to be perfect in terms of learning design. I think, but at the end of the day, if it doesn't actually result in an outcome, then obviously it also, from that point of view, doesn't really have any value. So My guess is that the way that we look at learning designs, I think sometimes we could be overly precious about how good we were in the past at it. Again, we've done research on this in the past, looking at it, and I think a lot of this is a bit in the eye of the beholder. That organisations and individuals sometimes can get very focused on how good a job they think they're doing, but actually the reality is often that they're not really validating that very much in terms of what impact it's having at the other end. I mean, my sense is that, good design is going to always be important, right? And thinking at it from a systemic point of view is also going to be really important. And I don't expect us to lose that, but I think maybe the way in which we measure the effectiveness and the quality of design maybe needs to change. The other thing is, obviously, I think there are individuals that have used that as a weapon not to change in the past, and I think at the end of the day, that's kind of been swept out a little bit. What we don't necessarily know, of course, is what the end shape will be in terms of the L&D organization and function. Other than inevitably, I think there's likely to be a shift away from face-to-face training delivery, obviously. So much of that will take a long time, if ever, to come back. And therefore the skill set of learning designers is going to be much more focused around that broader landscape rather than the very IoT centric or even basic e-learning content, fixed e-learning content design type approaches. So I think people need to be a little bit more diverse in what they're doing, and I would certainly like to see more focus on outcome and less on real outcome, not just in terms of measurable learning objectives, etc.
Yeah, definitely. And we were just touching there, David, on skills. And Sophie was asking, in your opinion, what skills do you think has got more critical over this time period that we've had over the last few months?
Well, there's some basic things, right? So digital skills clearly are in massively more demand. So there's a bunch of things around that, and that was already an area companies were struggling with to really recruit or to develop those skills at the level of speed they needed to. There was already a significant gap, so there's no way that gap's got better. It's definitely worse. I think the other side is from focusing less on maybe on an L&D point of view and just on business. I mean, there's, I think, a real change in terms of what we expect, face-to-face presence, for example, and some of the skills associated with that, even presenting and so on, have obviously changed. I think the way we engage with people, obviously, when we're doing that less physically and more virtually, or more in a more diverse way, the skills that individuals, that business leaders need to have, that managers need to have, listening is like a massively important thing. How do you listen in an online world properly? I think the other thing we shouldn't forget is that there's a lot of negative traits associated with being online and with digital as well. I mean, the internet proves that to us every day, doesn't it? And I think, therefore, the other side is people's behavior sometimes, I would say, particularly in a public sense, right? There are different rules that seem to apply in those things. So I think rethinking how we engage with people, how we listen to people, how we show empathy, how we understand what they're doing, but also ultimately how we manage and coach and develop people. Those are all become critical. So that's true within the L&D function and how the L&D function changes, as well as obviously all the technical changes that go with different tools and different medium. I think the other side also, though, is it's true around the leadership that L&D needs to show. The big challenge, I think, overall here is you've got to prove you're relevant and responding to this, right? And I think a lot of L&Ds have done a good job at doing that, but there is still the risk that they don't become as strategic as they should be in a company. That's something that I've always been, I think, probably quite critical around, is how in reality the L&D is not a strategic function in most companies. It's a laggard function and it's a support function. and it really is critical to this change. But stepping up and being able to deliver that and exposing yourself to the risks that come along with that is not straightforward. It's not thing. So I think it changes those skills for L&D leaders as well.
Yeah, so what I'm loving about what you've just said, David, is that whole business-centric approach, but remembering that we're people at the heart of it and people have emotions and we need to tap into all of that as well. So we're getting quite a few questions around digital learning, and I think people would love to have some definition as what you mean by digital learning. There's so many different ways of doing virtual learning, videos. So how are you defining digital learning with the research that you're putting out?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, I've been tracking this since before it was called e-learning before as well, right? So I go back to the days of computer-based training and et cetera and things like this, and actually looking at things like virtual tools and internet technology to support learning way before we even really had LMSs and virtual classrooms and everything. I think what we've seen is that now, I mean, first of all, that digital word gets stuck on the front of everything, and in some ways it hides a lot of stuff. But I think effectively, we're not super precious around it as a definition. I think effectively what it means is any kind of learning that is supported or enabled by digital technology. So that includes everything. You saw when I, for example, put up the content slide earlier, we're looking at people using, traditional e-learning, click and turn e-learning courses. We're looking at people running collaborative learning activities with the, discussion-based activities. We're looking at people using mobile technology. We're looking at people using video technology and so on. And I think one of the things that already happened maybe 4 or 5 years ago was that e-learning world, which was maybe dominated to some degree, I mean, I've said even before, I think hijacked a little bit by the e-learning content providers, and the idea that this click and turn e-learning content was the answer for everything online. And, we never felt that was true. And what's happened is that massively fragmented, as people started to look at things like video and mobile tools and breaking big e-learning courses down into little learning courses and micro-learning and adaptive learning and everything else like this. So digital learning for us is just the aggregation of all of those things, and it's just, as I said, just supported or enabled by the use of digital technology somewhere. Even if it's me speaking to you remotely over something like this, I think it's all part of the mix, right? So it isn't about, as I said, a singular strategy here. It's actually around the multiplicity and how do you enable those things. And interesting, obviously, organizations, the COVID research shows that in responding quickly, just leveraging what's out there in different forms and being able to sort of curate and package it up, and then maybe support that with things like virtual classroom, live sessions, or maybe some recorded video content is a really strong strategy. It's also very easy to adapt, right? So being agile is really important there, rather than spending a year building very big e-learning courses, right, which turns out that you don't actually end up running very much or so on. So.
Yeah, definitely. So really, once again, keeping the business at the heart. Now, in amongst all that digital learning, we've got gamification, and I think few people were quite interested to see that gamification was really rated quite so low. And so we'd love to know your thoughts on that. We've got 2 minutes left, by the way.
Yeah, so I think that's a big topic, right? So one of the problems I think with gamification generally, so there's a number of different angles there. I mean, one of the things is people talk about gamification around the interface to access learning, and some of the tools that you can use around that, and then you've got gamified content itself. What we know is producing high quality gamified learning content is typically quite a big and expensive activity, and I think one of the reasons maybe it's been lower in that adoption is just because it hasn't been as flexible, and it hasn't been, if time is everything, right? And maybe to some degree even cost is everything. So doing stuff fast and cheap that has an impact is really important. I think then that doesn't play to the strengths of gamified content anyway. I think there is then a challenge around the sustainability of learning going forward and how you build more value out of it. As I said, how do you know it makes it more of a difference? I think potentially gamification has more of an angle to play in that world. It's not just about pushing one thing out, it's around sustaining, so there are some dynamics around that may be relevant. But as I said, I just think, at the end of the day, people were less focused on hype and more focused on doing stuff quickly. And from that point of view, gamification is probably at a disadvantage.
Okay. David, thank you so much for sharing all of your insights. We're so grateful for you for doing this with us. So it is your chance now to take your screenshot of the QR code, and then I'm going to nip over to the next page where we can share some URLs. David, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So what you can now see on this session, on this page here, is some useful links that will be able to kind of bring this session together for you. You can also see there at the bottom of your screens that if you want to download the slides that David has provided all this great stuff on, then you can do it there. And of course, the recording and other sessions will all be available on the Learning Technologies website. Thanks everyone for joining, and I'm sure we'll see you on more sessions soon.
I'm just going to give people a few more moments. If you wish to download the PDF file of David's presentation, please click in the Files to Download box. It is to the left-hand side of the chat. When you click on the name of the file, a Download Files button will become active. When you click on that button, it will open up a download link for that file in your browser. If you could do that fairly quickly, because we need to close the session to release our license for the next session. Thank you very much for attending today. This is Learning Technologies Summer Forum, and we will be ending the meeting in 5 seconds.